Hello, I'm Bradley Alisea, and today I'm going to talk about Contributions 1. This is part of our unit on public events, discussions, and contributions. So let me share my screen, and we'll go over the notes that I have for today. Let's share my screen. There we go. Very good. Now, this is a diagram that I have of contribution scope. And so if you look at this diagram, it tells you a little bit about how we can conceive of a contribution. So contributions usually go from conception to final product. And so you can see here that an open source contribution starts with an idea. I have an idea. And then there's a post to a discussion board. So, we have a discussion board in our community. Most communities have some sort of means of discussion with other contributors or with, let's say, like a development team or a community manager. And then those discussions get picked up as either things that are popular or things that are bad ideas or neutral ideas. And so a lot of times it's up to the community manager to say, this is a good idea, we're going to promote it to some next step. Or this is a really bad idea. We try not to be negative, but we try to, help people craft their ideas. And so you're going to get down votes, you're going to get up votes. If you get a lot of up votes, congratulations. If you get no feedback, we might, depending on what the idea is, promote the idea. Or we might just, try to move it to the next step anyways. We try to use this feedback mechanism as a mechanism to judge quality, but sometimes that doesn't work. But in any case, you have an idea, you post it to the discussion board, and then we will promote it in one of two ways. The first is to promote it to some further discussion forum. In our case, we're going from like a feedback board, which is something available to the public, to our Discord server. And in our Discord server, we have a number of experts within the community who are talking about different topics. And so if your topic falls in it's promoted to the Discord server, then you will have a further discussion and you can refine the idea. If it's a really nice idea that's pretty well formed and has a lot of upvotes, then we might promote it directly to a new issue template. So this is where you contact the development team directly and say, this is an idea for something that we have. And so then you can get feedback from sort of the core team of programmers. Whereas the Discord server is more like, run it might be the case if you have other community members or people who are putting in volunteer time, developing different ideas. And so they're not really developing the core maintenance of the system, but they can give useful feedback. If that useful feedback happens in the Discord server, then it gets promoted again to this new issue. And then the code owners in that repository where the new issue is filed will suggest next steps, they'll comment, they will fit it within the scope of the development framework. And then you'll want to, you'll tag the code owner in the issue. You'll want to consult with our wiki stub and do those things to get their attention, to get other people involved. I have it here, tag code owner in issue. I guess you've already tagged the code owner in the issue, but if you have other people you're interested in communicating with on the development team, that would be the time to bring them in. Or other contributors from outside who you think might be interested. This all happens in GitHub. So if you have to have a GitHub account to be tagged in something. So if you end up contributing, you have to sort of register for a GitHub account here to use the feedback board. GitHub has a nice feedback board, and then you have a GitHub account here. So there's some barriers to entry, there's some procedure, there's we try to drive things from very raw ideas to very refined issues, and then things that can be resolved and incorporated into a contribution. So that's a contribution scope is. And so we use this to sort of evaluate what contributions are, how valuable they are, how to, they don't just come out of thin air. They have to be developed and nurtured. And so that's the larger point. And so how to make a contribution. So again, we've gone through these in previous sessions. The discussion and public event steps are two important parts of creating a persistent contributor. So when we want to create a persistent contributor, we want people to contribute, but it's a chicken and egg sort of thing. You can't have a contributor without them actually being involved in like discussions and public events and somehow invested in the community. Persistent contributors are somewhat rare. So, seeing someone go from a newcomer to a persistent contributor is an exciting process, but it requires some work. And so this next section, this is an analysis that was done on the Open Room community. So this is the Open Room Foundation. And this was done over from 2016 to 2020. And we zoom in on it again. We see that there are actually a couple of different categories of contributors. So you can see that when people have specialized roles in the community, and these are people who have contributed in the past to projects, or maybe they're leaders of projects, or they play some role in the community that's highly specialized and there's a time investment. They tend to have a lot of Slack messages. They exchange a lot of Slack messages, meaning that they're invested in the community and they're engaging with people. And so they're likely also to be engaging in GitHub commits and things like that, which we didn't measure. So that's something that gives you this sort of this meat of the distribution here. And then this long tail of the distribution involves other people who are, say, involved in the Slack, but don't post very many messages. And so these are people who are sort of at that beginning stage of being a contributor. They're maybe like lurking, or they're trying, maybe to pitch ideas. The ideas, need some work. So, you have people who are maybe just lurking in the Slack, or they're posting a couple of messages maybe a month. And so it's not particularly high volume, and they're not very invested in the community, but nevertheless, they're trying to be involved. And so I think the message from this graph is that it's relatively rare to find people who are very heavily involved in the community as contributors. So you need to have a lot of people coming through the community in order to get this sort of distribution of people. And this is replicated in different communities just by virtue of, not having everyone coming into the community if they, say, attend a hackathon, or if they, engage with some of your discussion forums, they're not automatically going to become a contributor. Or if they do, they become a very low volume contributor. So you want to keep that in mind when you're planning out things and you're trying to assess, how many contributors you might need to do some project. So a persistent contributor is someone who sticks around the community and continually engages beyond a single pull request or discussion. And I mentioned in the Open Room community, sometimes you can confer roles on people that help them develop their skills, or they've developed skills to the point where you can actually confer that title. And it's reinforcing. It gives people a reason to stick around. These people are rare with respect to all the people who might engage with your community, but become valuable leaders. So these people who contribute a lot are rare, but they become leaders because they're around, they know the processes, they know how to do things, and so they become leaders. Assigning specialized roles can also provide a means to create persistent contributors. Specialized roles can be project leaders, ambassadors, and I think in the last session we talked about ambassadors, ambassador programs, or power users. And power users are people whose use cases go beyond the typical user. So power users are people who might be involved in some really heavy duty coding project. And as a result, they've learned really how to use the GitHub repositories, or they've learned how to use some of the simulations, say like an open worm. They know that architecture pretty well. And so they're well suited to become a leader in the community or to use those tools in different ways. And so they can really be valuable. This is a beginner's guide to open source contributions. So this kind of goes over like, how do you sort of start participating in an open source community? So this is from WorkTech. And so this is it just kind of goes over the very basics of open source software and why you should contribute. And again, it's about just kind of maintaining the software, putting new features into software. And in open source, you can actually make that happen. So if there's a piece of software you're using and you'd like to see a new feature, you can actually contribute that feature. There are other ways to do this, other reasons to contribute. It empowers you, you can create what you use. So you're invested in what you're using, which is nice. But there are some prerequisites. There are some barriers to entry. They point out that you have to learn a programming language. And so in some communities, there are programming languages that are pretty obscure that they use. And those are things that are both, if you know that language, it's a valuable skill. But also, if you want to contribute in a meaningful way, you have to learn those languages. And so that is a barrier to entry. You also have to become familiar with version control systems. And so in our communities, we typically will give tutorials on this to newcomers. We want people to be able to sort of get up to speed pretty quickly on these things if they want to do something. And so if you have the initiative, you can learn all these things. They're not that hard, and there are ways to learn them. And there are also ways to contribute that don't involve being sort of an expert at version control. You can just use it as sort of an intermediate user and get the job done. And then as an advanced user, you can use it, you can do some task that involves version control, a really advanced, it requires very advanced knowledge of it. So, it depends on how you want to contribute. If you're an intermediate or beginning user or a beginning contributor, you might pick some issue that's, very, very low hanging fruit. Whereas if you're an advanced contributor, you might be able to handle some of the more exacting tasks in the community. You also want to get up to speed on Git, which is, of course, it's different than version control. It's this sort of platform that uses version control that controls access to software and open source software. And we've talked about this in previous sessions as well. And then you want to be able to know how to open source your projects, ideally, if you have software. And this involves sort of more than just dumping code out on the web. It involves spelling out kind of how to use it and how people might contribute. So if I put something up on GitHub, I don't just want to throw up the code with no documentation. I want to put some documentation out there. I want to really advertise that this code is open source, and I want to get some user base involved. So this is all, very much, you want to create beginner-friendly issues and all that. So this is very nice step-by-step, and these involve things that we've covered previously. Again, there's another resource on how to contribute to open source, participating in open source communities. This is from the Linux Foundation. And the Linux Foundation, of course, they have a lot of experience with open source platforms and contributors. And so it's really become a de facto way to build software. In every industry, so if you're in any industry you can imagine, there's an open source software package there. And there are always opportunities for contributors. And you want to become a citizen of the web or a citizen of open source. There's certain things you have to learn, certain conventions, but also, there are opportunities that open up as you learn your skills and you're able to apply them to these things. So they kind of go through why contribute to open source. Again, they have their own perspective on that. They have this graph, number of developers, the kernel version, I guess this is their own data from Linux, that it's increased, the number of developers, open source contributors has increased quite a bit over their releases. So from 2.6.12 to 4.7, there's been roughly a 4.5 to 5-fold increase in the number of developers. So that's pretty good because, as you know, software gains complexity over time. You gain, features, you have to have people to maintain them and all of that. And there also with Linux, you have different forks that get created. So you have different development teams involved with that. So all these things increase the number of developers. And, the community becomes very large sometimes. In the case of Linux, you have a lot of different forks and a lot of different things going on. So it can be very overwhelming, but I think you still have that pattern of, if you were starting out, you really want to find issues that are very tractable to you. And this just gives, things tips for people. You want to be able to attract talent to your project. You want to be able to lower the maintenance costs by having people who will attend to bugs or attend to maintenance. And then, this allows people to influence the direction the software goes in. So, you have an open source community that's engaging with the software. They can influence the direction of the software. They can influence whether the software becomes, security friendly or, security risk. And so this is very important for the development of the software. And then they have this section on how open source projects are managed. So you have leaders, maintainers, committers, contributors, and users. These top two categories are these power users that I mentioned before. The bottom three are not power users so much. They could be, but they can also be the long tail of users. And so the idea is to get people, as many people up into that upper category as possible, but just keep in mind that it's not always possible. So that's Linux's perspective. And then there's this patterns and practice for open source projects, which kind of walks through some of these. I guess it's not for business right now, but basically it goes through the opensource.com perspective on this using patterns and practice. So as they define it. Okay, so the next step is advertising GitHub issues. Now we had a chance to understand sort of what a contributor is and what they're doing, and what the patterns of contributors are in a project that you should expect. Now we want to advertise our GitHub issues. So our flow chart that I showed at the beginning, we go from this very fuzzy idea, and we try to refine the idea, and then we get to the point where we create GitHub issues on it. So creating GitHub issues is, of course, it doesn't come out of thin air. As I said, it does focus on specific tasks and things that we can boil an idea down into. So while persistent contributors are a laudable goal, highly specific contributors are also important. So sometimes this long tail of contributors, they do highly specific things. They might just come by to address one issue and then go away. And on paper, they don't look like they've done a lot, but they've actually maybe solved a very important problem in your community. So particularly if we want to accomplish a task for which we have no community expertise. So this is where, if we have like a security issue, we don't have too many security people in our community, there might be some person who's an expert on security come through and contribute to maybe 2 or 3 issues, and they solve the problem very well, elegantly. And then they leave. They don't have any reason to stick around anymore. And so they've done a lot for that project, but they've only done like 3 or 4 commits. And so on paper, again, they don't look like they've done much, but they have. And so this is one thing we'd like to recruit: highly specialized contributors. So how do we get those people? Or how do we get anyone, actually? How do we get anyone to address issues? So to get people to address issues, we can advertise our GitHub issues in our weekly meetings, in our discussion forums, our social media channels, and our newsletters. So we've talked about those different things before. The weekly meetings are events where it's somewhat informal, and you might want to, go through maybe some issues, and then pick an issue and go with it and work with it. And then, a discussion forum, you can link to an issue, you can link to specific issues, social media channels, same, and then newsletters also. Pick a meeting with time sensitivity where you can issue new calls for involvement. So this is this is an example of an issue, code tutorials for beginners number 3. And you might say, good at explaining things to people. See issue 3 from today's weekly meeting. So that's one way to do that. Another way is to have like a month-long campaign. And this is what we call Hacktoberfest. This is something that we've had in the past in Rockwire community. Is something you can host during the month of October. GitHub sponsors something called Hacktoberfest, which is an event where if you make 5 commits during the month for an organization, you get a t-shirt. So there's some incentive to contribute. And you spend the month advertising the project, and GitHub promotes projects during the time. It's just a way to bring people in. It's a thematic thing, it's fun, and it gets people involved. And so that's a campaign that you can do over a month. And so there are different campaigns you can run throughout the year. You can make up events, and you can tie in all of your, issues that are open to these campaigns. So this is Hacktoberfest. This is Hacktoberfest Meta, which actually involves also doing a lot of documentation and other things that maybe aren't as GitHub intensive as just, addressing specific issues and making specific commits. And then working with APIs. So we have an API where, you want to facilitate open source contributions. You want people to start using your API. An API is an application programming interface. And this serves as an integration tool that connects to services provided by the open source software. So this involves things like accessing specific resources, doing interactive exercises through an automated documentation and code server. So in the Rockwire community, we've used Swagger. There are other ways to do this, but you can basically walk people through documentation. You can also create tutorials and have people follow along, and then give them a badge at the end for their successful participation. You can offer selected functions or integrated data from a third-party application. So if you want to plug in another program into your software, APIs are the way to do this. And then interacting with existing features of the program. So providing data or other information. So if you go through different APIs, they do different things. The idea here in an open source community perspective is to promote your API, show that you can do things with the API, and then work around that, get people involved in it, use it in hackathons, things like that. And then beyond open source. So beyond open source, here's a tweet from someone who mentions that it's not just about open source. It's about open design, open development, open community. So those are the 4 opens. And they're very distinct, but they're all related. And so open source is only part of the equation, and usually refers to the code itself. But inclusive open source includes so much more than this. So product design, customized software development, and community building are all essential aspects of this. And so open source involves forkable code and copyleft licenses for software. Open design involves rapid prototyping, UI, UX, and building design features into your app. Open science involves creating open source software or creating code and data associated with research. Open development is building new features of the program or building new versions of that software if it works. Open community is hosting events and discussions with a group of people. So you can have all these opens, and they're all open in different ways. There's also open hardware, which is where you develop hardware and share the schematics and then connect it to the open source software. So there are all these different ways. Open design is where you, open up the design process for your software. So there are always different ways you can keep the software and the community open. And this is a way to really build this ecosystem and make it viable. So for more information, we have a lot of links here. Open design, driving design innovation through the collaboration of crowds, the Medium post, how open source increases access to computational tools for every scientist. This is an open science article, and it's from Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. So they have really advanced out of open science. You can also use open science in your human-computer interaction design. So, but you can also use open science. You can also design, if you're designing scientific software for practicing science. And so there are many ways that this can be incorporated into the community. Then there are Wikipedians. This is an example of a community where they don't really do a lot of code commits, but they do a lot of writing and writing topical stubs and then committing those and reviewing them with editors. In fact, they have a whole hierarchy of editorial staff, and they approve things and vet things. And so there's a article here, Wikipedians are born, not paid, a study of power editors on Wikipedia. And this brings out this idea of the power user. The power user is a special class of user who then pursues different topics and can do things in the community and are very valuable, a big asset to the community. So this is an article on this, and I would definitely check out the Wikipedian perspective. It's very different from typical open source software, but they do use a lot of these principles on the way. So thank you for being a part of this recording, of this session, and I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.